The Heidelberg School was a remarkably talented group of artists who gathered around the singular personality of Tom Roberts. Roberts had returned from England in 1885 and made contact with Fred McCubbin. 18 months later, he met the young Arthur Streeton sketching at Ricketts Point in Port Phillip Bay. In 1888, he went to Sydney and persuaded the Englishman Charles Conder to join the group in Melbourne. What they had in common was a passionate belief that the Australian painter should paint Australian subject matter. Every painting should be a direct response to experience. To do that, they had to take their easels and their canvases out of the studio and into the landscape itself. The Heidelberg School had a remarkably comprehensive view of what the Australian experience consisted of. It could be the zenith landscape, seen under the heat of the noonday sun, or it could be the moment of moonrise, of twilight. It could be the life of the cities or the life of the bush. It could be the society at leisure or the society at toil. One thing is certain. They changed the way in which Australians regarded themselves and saw the place itself. They changed Australia from a colonial mentality to an acceptance of the modern world, with the smell of the place and the life of the people as the true subjects for the Australian painter. Tom Roberts knew this by instinct. In Coming South, painted a year after he returned to Melbourne, he fixed on a fundamental Australian experience, the dreary rites of passage on the long voyage from Europe to Australia. The rigging, the mast, the smokestack and the ventilation shafts dominate the composition as they dominated the lives of the immigrants. No matter how glum the realities, Roberts was prepared to confront them and make a painting out of them. While Tom Roberts had been away in England, great changes had occurred in the National Gallery Victoria Art School. In 1882, George Frederick Follingsby had been appointed head of the school. Follingsby was a painter of sound academic practice. He believed that the contemporary painter should take subjects from contemporary life. He established scholarships for the students, and in 1884, Fred McCubbin came second with his painting Home Again. The painting has the simplicity and directness of a bush ballad. The husband has been humping his swag and returned home in the nick of time. His virtuous and hard-working wife has been compelled to take ironing in to make ends meet. And the hole in the carpet and the torn washing in the basket show how desperate the struggle has become. The swagman is an unmistakably Australian element in the painting, but we only catch a glimpse of the Australian landscape itself through the open doorway. 3 years later, John Longstaff won the scholarship with his painting Breaking the News. Here, the miner's wife hears the grim news of her husband's death from the old miner. Longstaff revels in the stained working clothes of the miner, and the anguished condition of the newly widowed woman is felt right through to her claw-like hand. But once again, the world outside is given to us only as a glimpse through a doorway. The third scholarship winner was Abby Olsen for his painting Flood Sufferings. Disaster in the mines by flood and fire were common parts of 19th century Australian experience, and Olsen has taken the anonymous heroism of the Australian bushman confronting natural disaster for his theme. The bushman improvised the stretcher from freshly cut saplings. But we only glimpse the outside world through the open door with its darkened and threatening skies. It will be the task of the Heidelberg School painters to take us outside these enclosed rooms and studio productions into the landscape itself and make the wide world the studio of the Australian artist. A decisive change from colonial painting to the Heidelberg School takes place in the landscape. A colonial master like Abram Louis Bouvelot in Summer Afternoon, painted in 1866, divides his landscape into blocks of light and dark, giving it a sense of enduring form. He delights in the picturesque details of the landscape. Compare it with the white heat and light of David Davies' painting, A Hot Day, painted 20 years later in the first flush of the Heidelberg School. The heat of the day spreads across the entire landscape, whiting it out in the glare. The broken forms of the fallen tree in the foreground are a far cry from Bouvelot's picturesque details. Here is a landscape consumed by heat and light, dry, empty, and severe. For the colonial painter, nature was a mighty spectacle, looked upon with awe, as Eugène von Gerard does in Mount Kosciuszko. The Heidelberg School painter, by contrast, worked happily within the landscape. Tom Roberts places an artist fairly and squarely inside his little painting, Quiet Day on Darebin Creek, painting directly from nature, not looking for those sublime moments of nature which the colonial artist so admired. The Heidelberg School painters felt at home in the bush itself. Towards the end of 1885, Tom Roberts, Fred McCubbin, and Louis Abrams set up the first artist camp about 3/4 of a mile away from the Box Hill railway station. Tom Roberts' loving description of this first camp shows McCubbin and Abrams about to eat their evening meal. Instead of the panoramic sweep of colonial paintings, we now enter an intimate world in which the microforms of the bush, the native grasses and saplings, are observed with care and delight. The world under our feet, not the world of lofty mountaintops, is now the essential part of the painter's experience. Fred McCubbin's Lost epitomizes the new intimacy of the Heidelberg School landscape. Here, McCubbin takes a close-up view of the bush, focusing on the peeling bark and the foliage between the viewer and the figure of the lost child. Throughout the 1880s, there were frequent newspaper stories of children being lost in the bush and often miraculously found. Julian Ashton had enjoined the Heidelberg School to paint Australian life, and McCubbin here found an appropriate figure subject to go with his new intimate feeling for the bush. The child has been gathering flowers in the bush and holds them in her apron, hinting that she is not far from home really. Streeton took the intimacy of the landscape and combined it with a sense of distance and space. Early summer gorse and bloom moves from the spikiness of the gorse in the foreground to a wide, sweeping horizon far removed from the viewer. Streeton retains the intimacy to the central motif of the girl standing at the fragment of the fence. For the Heidelberg School, the world was always populated, the landscape always inhabited. Along with the feeling of a new intimacy in the Australian landscape, the Heidelberg School knew that vast spaces, tall skies, and the heat of a summer sun were essential parts of the Australian experience. In his remarkable painting near Heidelberg, Arthur Streeton lets the human figure mark the boundary between the intimate world and the great expanse of the landscape beyond. The Heidelberg School were a remarkably homogeneous group. They went on expeditions together, and they shared images such as the bather in the landscape. Arthur Streeton's Yarra Valley at Heidelberg shows the bathers stripping off and bathing in the cool of the evening. Even in this somber twilight world, the figures are relaxed in the gathering darkness. In Tom Roberts' sunny south, the bathers are at the seashore, possibly somewhere near Sandringham on Port Phillip Bay. Then as now, nude bathing in Port Phillip Bay was rather frowned upon, and Roberts uses the male nude as the embodiment of freedom within the landscape. Charles Conder's version combines many of the most poignant elements of the Heidelberg School's depiction of the figure in the landscape. Here, the nude figures wade rather gingerishly through the reedy banks of the Yarra at Heidelberg, and their pale nude bodies and oddly awkward gestures give them a sense of intense vulnerability. The beach was a favourite subject of the Heidelberg School, where they could find Australian life naturally taking its ease and leisure in the open air. Fred McCubbin's Moy's Bay, Beaumaris, epitomises the Heidelberg School beachscape. The woman turns to her son so that we sense the particularity of the moment of the painting. There is not a single cliché of beach painting in it, selecting as he does a stony, pebbly beach with the dry and wiry seagrass sprouting from the shore. It is the world seen absolutely freshly, where normal human actions are played out. Tom Roberts at Mentone also chooses a fresh and vivid moment, the extraordinary stillness of the painting, as though the boat will never be pushed off from shore, nor the figures ever disembark. The woman who waits seems as still as the shadowy bluff behind her. The picture is entirely unspectacular, and yet its dependence on observed incident gives the painting its pristine quality. It is this moment and no other. The beach did provide the Heidelberg School with an occasion for the sun-drenched, heat-filled landscape. In Charles Conder's Bronte Beach, the broad strip of sand acts like a piece of blotting paper soaking up the sunlight. Here was the perfect motif for a landscape art which saw the sun as the principal actor in the landscape. One of the most remarkable pairs in the whole story of Australian painting are the two sketches made by Tom Roberts and Charles Conder in April 1888 at Coogee, shortly after they had met for the first time. Tom Roberts' holiday sketch at Coogee has brio, vigour and amplitude, grander in design than Conder's more modest effort. Roberts shows a society taking its ease, leisure and pleasure, dabbling in the obviously coolish waters of Coogee in April on a bright autumn day. The corner of the beach and the promontories jutting out into the brilliant ultramarine sea act like magnets for the light and the heat. Charles Conder, less heroic than Tom Roberts, delights in the quixotic nature of the human, with the young child pulling us down to the beach while her mother stands immobile, looking at the scene before her. That element of visual wit added so much to the temper of the whole school. Conder painted his witty masterpiece, Holiday at Mentone, shortly after his arrival in Melbourne in 1888. Here, the fashionable society of marvellous Melbourne disports itself. The lady in the chair has just discarded her fashionable Japanese parasol. The standing figure on the right tucks his stick under his arm, holds the lapel of his jacket with a worldly confidence. But what about the fallen brother between them, where heat, we trust, has quite overcome him as the bulletin falls from his hands and he falls sound asleep with his hat still firmly on his head. This panorama of fashionable life at the Bayside takes place under a drenching southern sun. The Australian experience was to be found as surely in the cities as in the bush. In his early masterpiece, The Departure of the Steamship Orient, painted when he was only 20, Charles Conder produced one of the first and finest essays ever on the Australian city. The ship returning to England is just clearing the dock, and the gloomy, rain-soaked atmosphere is filled with a nostalgia on Conder's part for the European world. The dramatic geometry of Circular Quay provides a firm architecture for the random crowd which is drifting off, lifting its skirts to get over the puddles and generally getting out of the rain. It was the first Heidelberg School painting to enter a public collection, bought by the Art Gallery of New South Wales in the year that it was painted. Ironically, when Streeton went to Sydney and painted Redfern Station just 5 years after Conder had painted his Departure of the Steamship Orient, Streeton too chose to see Sydney under the rainy, washy lights of an afternoon downpour. Streeton contrasts the busyness of the modern city, sheds, trains, bustle, carriages, children, men with flags, with the solitary figure hurrying out of the rain towards us. Tom Roberts' celebrated painting, Burke Street, 12 o'clock, shows marvellous Melbourne bathed in noontide heat. No other painting conveys quite as fully the bustle and density of Australian city life. Then as now, the prevailing Australian experience was of urban reality rather than pastoral concern. Roberts is concerned to show the variety of human types and commercial activities in the great colonial metropolis, from the vendors of ice to a fashionable trio with a mother and 2 daughters crossing the street. The noonday heat, the zenith landscape, is brought right home into the city, into the daily lives of the urban dweller. Fred McCubbin's view of Dickensian Melbourne in the 1880s is of a boom city built on the twin pillars of capitalism and Christianity. The smoke and the grime of the working harbour almost obscures the mighty Victorian city rising behind. The celebrated 9x5 exhibition, held in August 1889, declared the modernity of the Heidelberg School. Roberts and Conder decorated the gallery with Japanese fans, hung it with silk and knotted scarves. It was a large exhibition consisting of over 180 works, of which Tom Roberts contributed 62 paintings. It met with some stiff opposition from the established Melbourne art critics. James Smith declared that none of these are to be regarded as works of art. It was, however, a great success with the public. People paid sixpence to see the exhibition, and a large number of works were bought within the first few days. The cost was between 1 and 3 guineas per work. They were called 9x5 because that was the size of the cigar box lids on which most were painted. The exhibition was a ringing defense of impressionism. An effect is only momentary, they claimed. So in these works, it has been the object of the artist to render faithfully and thus obtain first records of effects widely differing and often of very fleeting character. The Heidelberg School were as good as their word. Charles Conder took us into the rainy streets of Melbourne in the touching and amusing panel, How We Lost Poor Flossie. Arthur Streeton took us to the football. Charles Conder, looking across to the Dandenongs from Heidelberg, typifies the 9x5 group with his rough and spontaneous response to the wide, extensive landscape before him, scratching the images in with the wrong end of the brush. Allied to their determination to set down truthfully and immediately the gritty realities of Australia, the paintings were also to be seen as aesthetic objects. They decorated their frames with gum leaves. Conder's A Winter Sunday at Heidelberg, showing Tom Roberts standing with hat on and Arthur Streeton seated at the table in the window, sums up the flavour of the period. Conder is so particular about moment and time. It is Sunday, July 21, this moment and no other which he is recalling. The impression is both of a place and a moment in the making of the school itself. Interestingly, this little masterpiece was owned for many years by the painter Fred Williams, who gave it to the National Collection. For the Impressionist, there is only the moment to be caught in paint. In Arthur Streeton's small panel, the long wave hangs and curls just for a moment before it crashes to the shore. There was, however, another side to the vivid, sunlit moment of apprehension. A moment is, of its very nature, fleeting and transitory, and this produced in the 9x5s a stream of melancholic, nostalgic pictures. Charles Conder, called this little painting Herrick's Blossom, recalling the transitory nature of the blossom as it blooms and falls. And his sense of melancholy extends to the little sketch portrait of a woman. The moonrise epitomizes that sense of the world being perpetually changed even in the moment in which it is perceived. The glow of warmth is still there in the landscape as it changes from day to dark. The 1890s saw great change to the Heidelberg School. Charles Conder returned to England, never to come back to Australia. Arthur Streeton moved to Sydney in 1890, shortly followed by Tom Roberts. What the Heidelberg School attempted to do in the 1890s, and in large measure succeeded, was to transform their vivid, diamond-like impressions of the 9x5 exhibition into epic, monumental form. The Heidelberg School now saw the figure in the landscape as an actor in history, altering nature and bending it to his productive purpose. In Arthur Streeton's greatest painting, Fires on Lapstone Tunnel, a tunnel is being driven through the rocky hillside. Development scrapes the landscape bare, revealing its very bones. Streeton depicts a moment of tragedy amidst the blaze at noon. A man is being carried dead out of the tunnel with his hands crossed over his chest. People rush down from the hillside, and a cart has spilled its contents onto the top of the tunnel. One can see the figures slipping and sliding as they hurry down to see what has happened in the tragic accident. The sheer hardness and abrasiveness of the landscape, the lack of picturesque details, makes Streeton's confrontation with the raw landscape of development all the more heroic. This was a new Australia which was unfolding before his eyes. Tom Roberts was to take the theme of labour and move us inside into the reflected sunlight of the shearing shed in Shearing the Rams. Roberts himself recalled how, lying on piled-up wool bales and hearing the subdued hum of hard, fast working and the rhythmic click of the shears, the whole lit warm with reflection of Australian sunlight, I had there the best expression of my subject, of strong masculine labour, the patience of the animals whose year's growth is being stripped from them for man's use, and the great human interest of the whole thing. Shearing the Rams traditionally forms the climax of that quintessential Australian activity of shearing. The bent back of the foreground shearer is the clue to the temper of the work as he grasps the back leg of the ram and tucks his horn under his elbow. Look at the strength of the shearer carrying the ram bodily from the pen onto the shearing floor. Roberts balances youth and age. The youthful figure of the rouseabout, who enters the picture with a gathered fleece in his arms, has all the grace of a Renaissance figure. The owner of the station, with hat and pipe, is the perfect complement, squatting relaxedly and thoughtfully on his haunches. The smiling tarboy is the only figure to look directly at us. What Roberts wanted to show was a society engrossed in democratic labour, where owner and worker shared a common occupation in the great activity of shearing. It was a fit emblem for the entire nation, showing the whole of the society bending in common purpose towards the productive use of nature. In Tom Roberts' other great epic of labour, The Breakaway, we see individual heroism in the Australian context. Here the drover rushes in to try and stop the mad breakaway of thin and starving sheep as they rush towards the waterhole amidst a drought-stricken land. The drover's dog has been rolled by the mad stampede, and the drover's mate is caught at the back of the mob, almost obscured by the dust. All that stands between disaster at the waterhole is the lone figure of the drover rushing in to prevent catastrophe. Behind him stretches the parched land with crows idling across the landscape and the willy-willies drifting in from the horizon. Here was the heroic landscape of heat and light with its proper protagonist. Fred McCubbin knew the different faces of the Australian bush. In Down on His Luck, the swagman pokes his fire disconsolately, and the bush, for all the majesty and beauty, is a place of alienation, the zone of the outcast. For the bush knew real poverty as well as winning riches from the soil. Fred McCubbin's bush idyll supplies the answering legend to Down on His Luck. Here, the young girl and boy are the embodiment of the innocence, the untouched qualities of the Australian bush, perfectly at home and in harmony with their surroundings as the girl looks thoughtfully towards the boy as he plays his homemade flute. The French Rococo masters of the 18th century loved this subject, but Fred McCubbin translates it into thoroughly Australian terms. Look at the sensible shoes and stockings of the bush girl, or the buttonless, collarless shirt of the youth. Arthur Streeton transferred to the landscape those epic longings which McCubbin and Roberts had shown in their figure paintings. Still glides the stream and shall forever glide, looks across the Yarra Valley from Heidelberg Hill to the distant Dandenongs. The transitory moment of magpies winging and cawing in the evening light is balanced against the sense of continuity as the Yarra winds its silver path forever into the distant landscape. The supreme heroic landscape of the Heidelberg School is undoubtedly Arthur Streeton's Golden Summer. Here we indeed meet the zenith landscape, with the sun, the great dominating factor enfolding the landscape. The young shepherd boy looks into the landscape, transfixed by its beauty. The world here is both intimately known and loved, and yet heroic in its scale, space, and brilliance. It is both a human world, yet wild and rough, abrasive to touch and feeling. The Heidelberg School answered Streeton's zenith landscape in the magical moment of moonrise, when the landscape gives up the heat and light to the dusky tones of evening. The masterpiece of this image is David Davies' Moonrise, painted in 1894, where the rough, scrubby field takes on a glowing luster as the moon rises above the horizon line. The empty, scraggy nature of the landscape shows how authentically observed and realized the theme is. The landscape is felt as it changes moment to moment. By 1900, the best days of the movement were behind it. Streeton had joined Conder in England, Tom Roberts was labouring on his huge painting of the opening of Parliament, and perhaps because he left Australia only once, Fred McCubbin alone maintained his vision of Australia to the very end. Yet all of them knew that they had lived at a crucial moment, and their great pictures of the 1890s reflect a sense of having lived at a momentous period in Australia's history. There is no grander display of the pastoral and the heroic in Australian landscape painting than Arthur Streeton's Purple Noon's Transparent Might. Looking down a broad reach of the Hawkesbury River, the sun at its height, Streeton surveyed a landscape mighty and sublime in its scale. Tom Roberts' Bailed Up, a picture on which he worked for nearly 30 years, reflects the contradictions of the later Heidelberg School. The landscape is marvelously realized, dry, flinty, bathed in heat and light. The incident itself, a stagecoach being held up by bushrangers, is brilliantly conceived and composed. Look at the angry man shaking his fist at the back of the carriage while his belongings are searched. There is always the charmer in every gang, and he's there, leaning up against the stagecoach, chatting to the rather anxious-looking woman within. Such details are a delight. Yet there is a theatrical quality to the painting, a bit contrived compared to the earlier, less self-conscious attempts to realize the Australian experience. There is an excuse for the rather high-flown Australianness of these later pictures. It was the moment in which Australia became a nation, and the earlier unself-conscious nationalism had turned to patriotism. Fred McCubbin captured the glory of Australia becoming a nation with his painting of Prince's Bridge, decorated and festooned with standards and minarets and triumphal arches for the occasion. Yet it was all a far cry from that first discovery of the magic and intimacy of the Australian bush. The final testament of the Heidelberg School is undoubtedly Fred McCubbin's The Pioneers. Conceived on a grand scale like a secular altarpiece, the story which it unfolds is a thoroughly nostalgic one. McCubbin looks back to the early life of the pioneers as they set out into the trackless waste of the bush. There the pioneer lights his fire amidst a wilderness. The pioneer's wife sits disconsolately on the ground with home thoughts from the bush. In the central panel, the split log and the axe, the cottage with the smoke issuing from the chimney, and the pioneer's wife holding the baby in her arms all show the progress of taming the bush and the beginnings of civilization. The final panel shows the grave of the pioneer, rediscovered in later times. In the distance, the city of Melbourne recognizably glimmers in the moonrise. Such is the product of the endurance of the pioneers. Yet through this march of civilization, from pioneering origins to the creation of the city of marvelous Melbourne, the bush goes on forever. The same trees are there at the beginning and at the end of the saga, and the foreground shows the foliage of the bush creeping endlessly and forever across the face of Australia.